Verterer, and I am president of the New Hampshire Archaeological Society. This afternoon, we're very excited to welcome Tom Martel III. Tom is an archaeologist and project supervisor with Cultural Surveys Hawaii. He is a volunteer at the Bernice Pauahi Bishop Museum, as well as a volunteer with various other communities. Tom is also a member of the Society for Hawaiian Archaeology. As I've said earlier, many of our presenters have a connection to New Hampshire, and Tom is no exception. Tom is a New Hampshire native of Abenaki descent, a volunteer with the New Hampshire Scrap Program, a member of the Manchester Historic Association, and a member of the New Hampshire Archaeological Society. Today, Tom is here to talk with us about Hawaiian archaeology. Welcome, Tom. We're excited to see something in the warm weather. We had snow here last Thursday, so welcome.
Thank you. Kwai Nidobak, aloha kako. Hello, friends and colleagues. I'd like to share an introduction in Hawaiian and an Abenaki dialect of the region to pay respect to the indigenous cultures whose heritage we study, who we work with, and where we live. My name's Tom Martel, and I'd like to share with you an introduction to Hawaiian archaeology and a brief comparison with New Hampshire archaeology. I grew up at the confluence of the Piscataquag and Merrimack rivers under the protective gaze of the Unkanuniks at a place called Amoskeag, which you will probably recognize better as Manchester, New Hampshire. Give a brief bio of myself. As I said, I was born and raised in New Hampshire, where I lived until high school, and then I moved to Arizona for high school and most of college, and then finished up my college and currently residing in Hawaii. I've got a few pictures here to kind of link the three locales that I've called home. We have petroglyphs at 3 sites in each state. We have some petroglyphs at Kitsipontegu, the Great Falls, otherwise known as Bellows Falls, Vermont, which is right across the river from North Walpole, New Hampshire, and a panel of petroglyphs from Cottonwood, Arizona. And there's a picture of me with a panel of petroglyphs from a lava tube cave on the Big Island of Hawaii. I'd like to give you a disclaimer that I'm just going to very briefly cover these topics. All of these bullet points could be covered in much more detail, but due to the limited time, I'd like to focus a bit more on archaeology than just history. But I do have to provide a bit of history for context. Here's a map showing the relative dispersals of Polynesian peoples. I'd like you to please disregard the dates, as they're just basically arbitrary. But as you can see, these seafaring people island hopped from area to area, and then they eventually made it to the far-flung islands of Hawaii to the north, Rapa Nui or Easter Island to the southeast, and Aotearoa or New Zealand to the southwest, which forms the Polynesian Triangle. Before the Polynesians dispersed to these far-flung corners, they experienced a culture that is labeled as a Lapita culture that had such technological innovations as pottery, which was lost by the time the Polynesians settled Hawaii. So unfortunately, we can't link the pottery of Hawaii and the pottery of New Hampshire because they did not have pottery here in Hawaii. It is likely that they just had the more expedient and easily manufactured gourds to carry water and other provisions. How did these incredible seafarers make it to these far-flung locales, often completely isolated and most isolated landforms in the world? They did this by being expert navigators and having incredible knowledge of the ocean, tides, currents, and especially their astronomy skills. They often relied on stargazing to navigate their ways over immense stretches of endless ocean. Also, another theory is that they followed migrating birds, which would have taken generations and generations to reach these far-flung locales. And while they were dispersing to these islands, they had a specific purpose of colonizing these new areas where humans have never set foot. And they often came well equipped and prepared to start up a new colony, bringing what we like to call the canoe plants, various food items such as taro, bananas, etc., and also bringing mammals for food source, such as pigs, dogs, chickens, and then the stowaway rats. In Hawaii, there were two waves of migration. There was an initial occupation, which there's some disagreement when it occurred, somewhere between 2,000 and 1,000 years ago. Generally, we'll settle on 400 or 500 AD. And Hawaiian oral tradition states that a second wave of immigrants came in, probably from the Tahitian Islands or Marquesan Islands. And when they came, they brought a much more rigid hierarchy, expanded religion, and more diverse canoe plants, such as the ulu or breadfruit tree. Here's a small timeline to give you a little bit of an idea what was going on in Hawaii versus the world. As you can see, in 1778, Captain James Cook made landfall in Hawaii. So to provide a relative date, this is after the United States became an independent nation. So in comparison to the Native American sequence up in New Hampshire, northern New England, and the Americas, it happened at a much later date. With the help of European weapons and knowledge, King Kamehameha went on a series of conquests with wars and treaties to unite the Hawaiian Islands into a kingdom for the first time. And this also reflects a European influence by having a kingdom rather than their chiefdoms. With the contact by Europeans, very rapid changes occurred throughout Hawaiian society. Initially, sandalwood was a trade item that was harvested from the mountains and sold to China and elsewhere by fur traders and whalers. The missionaries came and introduced Christianity to the Hawaiians, and eventually the original Hawaiian religion was abolished. They call this the abolishment of the kapu system, which, if I said it in Tahitian, a closely related language, you might understand better. Kapu in Tahitian would be taboo. So it's basically a strict hierarchy with many rules to follow. Unfortunately, similar to the Native Americans of the Americas, when the Europeans came, they brought with them diseases that these people did not have the immunity to, and it wiped out vast amounts of the population. After that, sugar plantations began to pop up, and there was a need for a workforce. And so there were many immigrants from various countries, such as China, Japan, the Philippines, and Portugal. They were basically came to work the fields, and then eventually most of them stayed and set up their lives here in Hawaii. Alongside that sugar plantation history, there's also generally not well known on the mainland of America about the illegal overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy, which eventually led to, in the future, to Hawaii becoming a territory and then a state. Around the middle 1800s, Hawaii introduced the concept of private property, and in something that's regarded to as the mahele. So in the mahele, basically large swaths of land were given to the upper elite of Hawaiian society, and the commoners had to provide context and reason for why they should be awarded these small plots of land to which they lived and worked on. Here I have a little map of the west side of downtown Honolulu, and this shows you basically how the land was divided during the LCA. You can see these small plots of land that were awarded to the commoners. One of the useful tools for archaeologists is when they had to try to gain recognition and title to these lands, they had to provide land use documentation. So often for these areas, we have a pretty good heads up as to what the land was used for, such as for wetland irrigation, for dry land plantings, whether it was pasture, whether or not they have a house site on their land, and things such as that. So we have a pretty good record of the land use here, as opposed to areas like New Hampshire, where when lands were reclaimed by European descendants, the Native Americans typically have moved off the lands and settled in other locales that were safer for their survival. Also along those lines is with the relative late arrival of European contact and the incredibly high literacy rates of the Hawaiian population, much of the culture was preserved and documented, not just through oral traditions, but they began to write books, have newspapers here in Hawaii in the Hawaiian language, which preserved a lot of these cultural traditions. Here's a map of Oahu, where I live and work, do most of my work, and I'll be taking you on a few little trips here. We'll be going to the north shore of Oahu. We'll be heading to the windward side of Oahu, and then we'll be down in the town area near Honolulu. As you can see, there's a very large mountain range here. These are the Ko'olaus, as well as the Waianaes on the west side. And we have a windward versus leeward type of weather pattern, where the winds and rains are coming in from the northeast, battering these mountains, which forms sheer cliffs, which we refer to as Pali. And the west side of the island is generally much drier. So different forms of agriculture and settlement patterns. And Hawaii generally is divided up by ahupua'a. So if you imagine the island as like a pizza, and each slice of pizza would be an ahupua'a that extends from the ocean up to the back of the mountains, and would provide valuable resources for living in these communities, and further broken up into moku, which are referred to as districts. So there's a very brief primer on Hawaiian history. I'm sure you'll have many questions you can save for later. Now we'll get into archaeology. So archaeology and cultural resource management. Although I'm an archaeologist, my job is a cultural resource management. And in our minds and the general public's minds, they imagine pictures like the one on the left, hiking through the thick jungle with a machete, maybe a bullwhip and a fedora. But in reality, most of our work is like what you see on the right, where we're monitoring construction projects for development. So a lot of this, we stand alongside these construction companies and watch them as they excavate, document the stratigraphy and any potential historic properties, and try to protect whatever we can. Here in Hawaii, we are bounded by many state laws, which are very protective generally to help protect these valuable cultural resources. And while the system isn't perfect, they generally protect these resources much better than much of the mainland. We work on military lands, federal lands, state lands, private property, and a lot of these are very contentious projects on sensitive sites with sensitive cultural deposits. So we work very closely with cultural monitors. These are people of Hawaiian descent who work alongside us. And we also work with different island burial councils depending on the island you're working on. And throughout my work in CRM with my company, Cultural Surveys Hawaii, I've had the opportunity to do basically every aspect of archaeological work I could think of, from report writing, lab analysis, surveys through various terrains, AIS and data recovery projects, and also our bread and butter of the industry, monitoring. So for those of you who are not familiar with archaeology, it's not just digging holes in the ground and looking for artifacts and things like that. We are basically a multidisciplinary field, and we basically have to be jacks of all trades in the intellectual community. It's not just a study of archaeology. We have to have a background in all anthropological fields, as well as botany, cartography, geography, geology, history, linguistics, and many, many more. To highlight some of these skills that are good to have as an archaeologist, we'll talk about the botany. Here we have a tea plant, TI, or key plant in Hawaiian. And these are great indicators of archaeological sites, especially when you're in the upland mountain regions, because these have a very hard time of reproducing without the help of human hands. So if you're in a distant, thick jungle and you see one of these tea plants, you have to have known that humans had stepped foot in this area. And often there are archaeological sites within close vicinity. To relate that somewhat to New Hampshire archaeology, it's also important. You can look at locations of fruit and nut bearing trees. You can, if you are very familiar with plants, you can tell whether the plant systems need to have deep roots or shallow roots, and you could tell possibly where there may be a historic cellar or something of the kind based on the types of plants that are growing over these soils. In terms of geology, I have a picture here with New Hampshire scrap at Mount Jasper, which was a lithic quarry source, high quality material for making stone tools. Same thing as in Hawaii, the high quality materials were often sought after at specific quarry sites, such as the top of Mauna Kea. a way that linguistics can tie into archaeology is to follow these paths of dispersal of these languages. So if you look at the image here, we have the Polynesian language, and if you trace back these roots of the language, you can get a better sense of the dispersal of the communities. And the same thing goes for Algonquin languages in New Hampshire and New England. You can see closely related languages, and you know that culturally they're very similar. Also, for archaeologists, things such as place names, if you know the definitions of the indigenous languages, it may help you get a better idea of where you are, what you're looking for. For instance, we can talk about Amaskag, which means the fishing place or the great fishing place, used as a locative description. So if you were doing work in the area, you may know to look out for fish-related products. And these names often appear in other places throughout New England. Not only is there Amaskag, which is Manchester, New Hampshire, but there are other places, Namkag, Namaskik, which are essentially the same exact word, just transcribed differently, possibly due to a slight dialectical difference. Same here in Hawaii. Use an example, Waimea, reddish water. There's Waimea on probably each island, but many different locales. There's a Waimea, which describes a reddish water where rivers are often flowing into the ocean, providing siltation. I could talk about any of these subjects much more in depth, but we'll go on into a bit of the archaeology. Here's a photo of the North Shore of Oahu, otherwise known as the 7 Mile Miracle for its world-class surfing spots. Location and setting are very important in archaeology to provide context for the sites you may be looking for or studying. And we're here on the North Shore. I'll just be describing mostly some of the jobs I've worked on rather than focusing on the fantastic monumental structures and things of the sort. So one of the projects I was working on the North Shore, here's a photo. In the foreground, you can see a crudely constructed wall. And if you look in the background behind the meter tape, you can see some nicely faced stones here. And I'll go to a close-up of that. And it turned out that this was a habitation platform. You can see the nice facings along the side and relatively flat, made of stone. And talking to some of the old school archaeologists that I work with at my company, they've agreed that this was one of the nicest house platform sites that they've seen on the island of Oahu. Throughout this job, we encountered more than 150 identified features. And in terms of date ranges for this area, pond cores from a nearby pond have settlement at roughly 800 to 950 AD. And the carbon-14 dates that we were able to obtain from our limited excavations roughly clumped around 1400 to 1600 AD, suggesting late occupation from the early pre-contact period, extending in almost into the post-contact period. So this is like what a house platform would look like. You can use your imagination to imagine a grass hut built atop this. Some of the other features we observed in the area were entire complexes of dryland and wetland agricultural systems. Here we have a nicely faced rock wall that's filled, the core is filled with some smaller cobbles and pebbles. And these walls generally are quite beautiful for being standing for hundreds of years and being subject to various factors such as erosion, cattle grazing, and farming. Typically, the wetland agriculture is located near perennial streams. And these two areas I'm showing you, they were more associated with dryland agriculture. And the photos don't quite do it justice because the vegetation is so thick. So you can see the wall here, but you can't see the immense nature of these complexes. So that was a bit of dryland agriculture while we're going over these surface sites. And then we'll head to another locale on the windward coast of Oahu. Here's a historic picture of the Pali Coast. You can see these vertical cliffs that were formed by rain and winds over thousands of years. So in the bottom of the picture here is where the overland route to cross the island would be. And you can see from the potential of climbing over this mountain that it may have just been easier to transport materials and yourself by canoe around the island than to take the overland route. Here also, setting is important. There are many legends associated with this area. Most of these individual peaks have names, and some of them have specific legends. Keahi Kaoe over in this area has a legend relating to the sharing of resources in times of famine and highlights the aloha spirit that is so famous in Hawaii. And the area of Kaneohe roughly translate as bamboo man, and the legend goes on to explain of this man who lived in the forest here, and he had his flute of bamboo. So one of my great projects in this area, you can see an overhead view here after we had cleared large swaths of vegetation. I would provide you with a before picture, but it would just be a wall of green. This was very, very thick jungle, and me and the crews that I worked with worked very hard to clear this area to provide documentation of some of these sites. And so here's a map that was generated by the Bishop Museum in their initial studies of the area. And we have a stream that's flowing along here. And just as in New Hampshire and regions of New England, water is of the utmost importance. And that is highlighted in the term for law in Hawaiian, which is waiwai, which basically means water. Water was very important. So here highlighted, we have these rock-faced terraces that were mainly used to grow taro, which was the staple crop of Hawaiians, much like corn for Native Americans and rice for Asians. Taro was the main crop, the main source of dietary supplement. So throughout this thick vegetation, rugged terrain, we were able to identify a number of features. In this area, there's approximately 250 surface sites. It was quite impressive and really one of my favorite experiences as an archaeologist working in the area, seeing these beautifully stacked and faced walls, terraces that followed the contour of the land. And with the river or the streams flowing, they would tap into that with auawai, or basically water channels, to feed into each lo'i or pond field. Throughout this area, we had a wide range of surface sites, from wetland agriculture, dryland agriculture, habitation, ceremonial structures, including heiau, which roughly translates to a temple or a place of worship. And there were also historic features in the area, such as kilns for making charcoal. A hearth date from the area provided a date of 1100 AD for occupation of this area. Although it experiences much erosion, much natural damage, this area had to constantly be replenished and refurbished. It wasn't like you set up these stone walls and they're there stationary forever. Here's a closer view of that same wall. This one is particularly important because over here to the right, there's a notch, and then the wall continues this way. Notches are generally regarded as very important, and this likely served as some kind of ceremonial function as well. So we went through some of the surface sites that I've been able to document, and now I'll take you on a little trip to the subsurface sites. First, I'd like to show you one from the North Shore area where we excavated a few of these rock mounds. As you can see, there wasn't much to find. We found basically just some charcoal, but not associated with a distinct feature. It could have been fluvially transported through erosion or such as that. In fact, the artifacts that we found in the area were just from the surface, such as the adze fragment, which was almost kicked over by a colleague of mine. I'll take you on to some more typical stratigraphy down on the south shore of Oahu, where we have sand and beach dunes, and most of the development that spurs our work is located in these beautiful beach settings. So this is a very typical stratigraphic sequence that we would see here in Hawaii. We have the modern asphalt surface at the top, associated base course, and a mixed demolition fill. And we have this ubiquitous crushed coral and hydraulic dredge clade fill. These to me, are great tools for archaeologists here in Hawaii because they're from a known fill event when they would send barges offshore and pump this marine material, this clay and this coral, to fill in low-lying areas to make them more suitable for habitation and development. And you can see it makes a nice cap over these natural deposits. Here we have the historic redeposited fill, which was likely from the truncating of the A horizon, of the natural A horizon from disturbances with possible historic A horizon formed on top. Underneath that, you can see the intact A horizon. And when I say A horizon, for those of you unfamiliar, that basically means a former living surface or land surface. So this was a culturally enriched A horizon with charcoal, artifacts, and features in it. And you can see that the diffuse boundary between the A horizon as it grades to the natural sand, which we call a Jockus sand here in Hawaii, and it's basically a backshore sand dune. And that's overlaid on top of natural coarse sand and the marine sandy clay, and that sits on top of the coral shelf, which is approximately where the water table is. So that's a general view of stratigraphy we expect to encounter in these backshore sand dune settings on the south shore of Oahu. I'll show you one of the more exciting features I've been able to document widely are these things called salt pans. They were basically, if you can envision it, earthen berms that resembled large swimming pools. They were massive in size, roughly the size of football fields each. So here you can see those pumped dredge and crushed coral fills that make a nice cap over these deposits. Here in the foreground, on the low-lying portion, is the salt pan itself, where they would use liners and they would basically collect ocean water, close off their gates, let the water evaporate, and then collect the salt. And then in the background, you can see the berm, which we'll get a better view of on the next slide. And then I'll show you a closer view of the salt pans themselves. So here's the berm of the salt pan. And these are considered anthropogenic soils, as in humans altered them and made them. They're largely derived of locally procured materials, sand, clay, sandy clay, and redeposited here to make these features. To see a nice view of the salt pans, these were liners. You can see these thick deposits with organics intermixed with layers of clay. These were laminated layers. You can literally peel them off one after the other, and you can see the imprints of the leaves that they used to line these salt pans. It's quite an interesting site, and they're quite common in the Kaka'ako area of Oahu, which is between Waikiki and Honolulu. I'd like to share some stratigraphy from a site I worked on Kauai next, just to highlight the incredibly thick A horizons and cultural deposits. It's something I've never experienced in my life. These deposits were up to 5 feet thick in places, suggesting that the land use here was over a long period of time. It was a very high valued land, and the oral traditions, legends, and settings can attest to this. So here you can see me and one of my colleagues excavating these test units. We put 3 1-by-1 test pits right in line to basically form a trench. From the bottom of this, roughly where I'm digging right here, we encountered a hearth feature, which are great for providing context and accurate dates. So when you collect charcoal from an archaeological setting, it's always best to collect it from a feature such as a hearth, which shows you an exact event. There was somebody here with a fire at this time, as opposed to just charcoal from the layer, which could have been brought in by wind or water. And here in Hawaii, in the past, we've run into the problem of inaccurate carbon-14 dates due to using old-lived tree species. So if you use a piece of redwood that washed ashore from the west coast of America that was set into a fire, those have an inbuilt date range that can range from 1,000 to 2,000 years. Those trees live an incredibly long time. So there's a bit of inbuilt age there. So ideally, the best thing we like to find in a feature such as this is a carbonized kukui nut, a candle nut, tree nut. And those are very short-lived species and can provide a very short period for occupation. Within the same unit, we found some of the more amazing artifacts I've been able to find on my work site. We found some shell and bone fish hooks. The one on the left is a shell hook, and the middle and right one are bone fish hooks. And you can see the one on the right is perfect quality, absolutely beautiful. And a famous archaeologist here in Hawaii by the name of Shinoto worked on the South Point Pu'uali'i sand dune site on the Big Island of Hawaii and was able to identify stratified cultural sequence of relative age for these different forms of fish hooks. That helped to identify also the cultural evolution of Hawaiians from a more generic Polynesian population into a very distinct Hawaiian population. And I'll just throw in a few other artifact forms. Here are some stone tools. On the left, we have poi pounders, which were used to mash up the taro into their favorite form of the food, poi, which is like a purple paste. And as you can see, there's a lot of intricate work into designing these. And it would be something akin to a corn pounder over in New Hampshire, which they can vary from crudely constructed to elaborate and ornate with effigies and the such carved into them. On the right, we have some basalt adzes, which function similar to a tomhigan or tomahawk axe or other gouge or an adze in New Hampshire. And they were similar function for chopping down trees, hollowing out logs to make dugout canoes. Other than that, in New Hampshire, mostly due to the acidic soils, we don't have much that survives the archaeological record, save for stone tools. So these are kind of the best comparisons for cultural. We know that there were ropes, fibers, and things made of organic materials in New Hampshire that just can't survive in the acidic soils, save for maybe a lucky cave location. Here in Hawaii, a lot of times those organic materials don't preserve well either, but in caves you can find things such as the tapa cloth, the cloth that they made from plant fibers, and cordage for things such as nets for fishing and ropes for their boats. And while we're in the subsurface, I will go into briefly into the historic era. That first map I showed you at the beginning with the LCA and in the downtown Honolulu area. I had this great project where I was part of the initial investigations of AIS. And then I also did the archaeological monitoring for the majority of the project and wrote the report. So here in this historic photo, you can see that there was this line of shops along the street, and they were all hotels, drugstores, and other associated shops with the Japanese immigrant population. And while working and monitoring there, in addition to the traditional type resources, we identified the subsurface structural remnants of some of these buildings, which are highlighted on this plan view map, as well as some artifacts from the historic era, Japanese beer bottle, medicine bottle, and we found a whole assortment of household goods such as soy sauce containers, rice bowls, and sake cups, things of the sort. So I took you on a nice journey through some surface sites and subsurface sites. What's left, do you ask? We also have underwater archaeology here in Hawaii. Pictured here is a fish pond, which was constructed in the pre-contact times and is still standing today, which were used to basically grow and harvest fish. With the return to having food sovereignty and the such, and reduced carbon footprints of growing and sourcing food, looking at archaeological features such as this and the immense patches for growing taro and the such, that this island could potentially support its own population with food if all of these traditional structures were reinvigorated and put to use. Unfortunately, most of these fish ponds here on Oahu, as I highlighted with the crushed coral and pump dredge fill, these fish ponds provided a nice barrier, and the crushed coral and pump dredge was pumped into these fish ponds and infilled, and then houses and other structures were built on top of these newly reclaimed lands. Although occasionally we will get to survey a site such as this, typically we encounter fish ponds in a subsurface setting that were infilled back in the historic era, roughly 120 years ago. Some further analysis of these deposits I presented at the Society for Hawaiian Archaeology conference in the past about the usefulness of fish pond snails in the fish ponds. And if you look at the specific species of these snails, you can kind of recreate the environment, whether it was freshwater, brackish water, or marine water. And often our findings completely agreed with the oral traditions of what kind of fish and what setting these fish ponds were in. In addition to these traditional resources, there are also some great sunken ships, planes, even tanks in the waters that offer great snorkeling and practice for underwater archaeology. And in this slide, I had to include at least one of the monumental structures. In the background, we have Ulupo Heiau, which is a massive structure built of piled stone. And the legend relates that this massive structure was built in one day by carrying stones from the mountains to this area. And in the foreground here, you can see an active taro lo'i or taro patch, which is fed by a natural spring right at the base of this heiau. And behind me in the photograph is a natural wetland as well. This is a very storied and legendary locale as well. And with that, I'd like to say, and wrap things up and say thank you to New Hampshire Archaeological Society, all of the presenters and participants, the New Hampshire Scrap Program. I was fortunate enough to start volunteering at a transitionary period and had the pleasure of working with Dick Bovair and Mark Doporalski. And like to thank all of the Archaeological Society and Scrap volunteers, including and not limited to George, Mikey, Tom, Judy, David. I'd like to thank the Manchester Historic Association and my good friend Brownie, Justine Grengas, who does wonderful work with the Manchester Historic Association. I'd like to thank my colleagues and coworkers at Cultural Surveys Hawaii and the indigenous communities here in Hawaii and New Hampshire I've had the pleasure of working with and meeting. And I would like to dedicate this presentation to my father, Thomas Martel Jr.
Great, thank
Mahalo
you.
nui loa, Kitsiuliuni. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. That was excellent. We do have some questions from the audience. The first question is, before the European contact, was there travel from Hawaii? I know you documented the travel to Hawaii. Was there travel from Hawaii?
Basically, it's understood as there were the initial colonizers who settled in Hawaii, followed by a period of isolation. And then, as I stated in that earlier graphic, that there was a second wave of immigration to Hawaii of Polynesians, and they are generally assumed to have brought a stricter hierarchy, more canoe plants, and different religious aspects such as the cult of Pele and traditions such as surfing, followed by another long period of isolation until Europeans arrived. Although we have evidence to suggest that there was quite some interaction between these far-flung islands and even the Americas the greatest piece of evidence is the sweet potato, which originated in the Americas, and the name Ualu is very close to the indigenous name for that, and it transported to Easter Island and then made its way to Hawaii, where it became a staple as a dryland agricultural product.
Great. I have a question here. Can you comment on the amphitheater cave on the Malulipi, south coast of Kauai? Did I say that right?
I can't remember exactly off the top of my head. The Makalawapai cave, something along those lines.
Yeah.
Yes, I've had. Unfortunately, I have not been to that specific site, but we have some analogous type features here on Oahu, where there are these limestone caves and pit caves that typically, flightless birds from pre-Hawaiian contact and into the initial colonization, these flightless birds that are now extinct would fall into these pit caves, die, and then their bones are preserved at the bottom of these pit caves, providing much chance for analysis.
Wow. Another question. Tom, what's the typical artifact assemblage at a house site? A pre-contact house site, that is.
It would vary depending on location. Generally, if you were close to the shore, you would expect more marine resources. In addition to a house site, I think just saying a house site was a bit general of me, but it was often a complex. You would have separate house sites for men and women, separate eating areas. You would have a small, possibly a small altar for worshiping your family gods or something of the such. So each house site typically had a complex of associated structures. At a near shore environment, you would expect to find possibly a canoe house where they would store their canoes, and then lots of fishing gear from like fish hooks and adzes for creating your dugout canoes. Game pieces, there's ulu mica, which are like basically stone discs that you would roll, and all sorts of various tools for like household items. Whereas if you look at more in the mountain setting, you're probably lacking on those marine resource type artifacts.
Mm. Okay. Next question. Did the earliest Hawaiians have a written language?
Not that we know of. Things were preserved generally through oral tradition, much as the Native Americans. There are those petroglyphs, which might be the closest relative to a writing system, although same thing with in the Americas, the analysis and interpretation is pretty open. Once Europeans arrived and introduced reading, writing, literature, the Hawaiians took off running with it and became basically the most literate population probably in the world per capita.
Tom, you showed us a slide with the walls, and were those walls property boundaries, or what function did they serve?
Sometimes it's a bit unclear what the specific function of each wall is. Those were likely related to agriculture, although a wall of that size, I would have an inkling that it may be a boundary wall to set up along, an Ahupua'a boundary or something of the sort.
Okay. A question about the salt. Was the salt traded to other areas or was it used for food preservation?
It, the salt manufacturing, in some locales it persists today. It was used ceremonially. It was used for food, and typically, though, with those very large salt pan features I was showing you, that extended into the post-contact era, and that would likely be more associated with the trade good with whalers and the such, so they could preserve their meats for their long journeys across the ocean.
Nice. Tom, what lithic raw materials are available on the island? I know you showed us some slides of the ads and the poi pounders. I had a question about what the poi pounders were actually made from, but what lithic materials are available there?
So being volcanic islands, basalt, volcanic rock is the primary source, and you would look for the Hawaiians would look for the very fine-grained, dense basalt as opposed to the porous material that is a bit more ubiquitous. So that really dense material often comes from dikes and upland mountain regions where they would have specialists basically go up and harvest and cut these rocks up into preforms and then transport those preforms down to a more livable area and then chip and polish those down to their final forms. So mostly everything is basalt. The occasional tool or ulu mica may be made out of coral. And I have heard that there may be some chert from around here, but I have not found any definitive evidence to suggest that just yet.
And the pounders, what were they made from?
Same thing. Those were typically made out of the very fine grained basalt, and they would have been chipped and polished down to those beautiful forms that were highlighted in the photo.
They are beautiful. You mentioned grass huts. Was stone and coral used for building construction or primarily for land control? In the introduction, you mentioned that you would do volunteer work for the museum in Hawaii. What kind of work would you do?
So talk first about the house sites. Typically, there was a pavement of stone and possibly a perimeter wall made of stone, and then the huts themselves were constructed of logs from trees and thatched grass from certain types of grasses. And in terms of my volunteer work at the Bishop Museum, it was primarily with lab sorting, looking through midden samples and separating them out, and working with some fish hooks from that South Point Ali'i sand dune site, which to me was a great honor to work on such a great archaeological project that's so important to us here in Hawaii.
Great. Tom, you talked a bit about the cultural significance of water. Was this just for agriculture, or was water power important as well?
It was typically it was important for the agriculture, which in turn also provided a degree of power, and it showed that you had to basically get along and work well with others, because if somebody upstream decides that they want to block off these aowai or water ditches, then that means everybody downstream, I guess, they're out of luck and their crops are going to fail because they're not being watered. So that's particularly why the water was important, as well as a source for drinking water, being surrounded by the ocean salt water, which you cannot drink.
I have two more questions. Is there any Lidar data available for Hawaii?
There is some LiDAR data available. It's not like what we have in New Hampshire, where they have basically the whole state LiDAR. There's it's probably project by project. If somebody wants to pay for it, then they can go ahead and pay to have LiDAR done in the area. But with the high number of military bases and the such here in Hawaii, it's I'd imagine that a lot of areas are off limits with LiDAR type data.
Great. So one more question, Tom. Did pre-contact Hawaiians need to control their population numbers?
That I don't know that I could offer a really good answer to it, but there generally it seemed like the population was continually increasing up until European contact, and there was much greater intensification of these agricultural systems and the fish ponds, which come at a relatively late date, that provided ample food source for a large population. Like I said, we could probably support our current population here on Oahu if we had all of our fish ponds and taro ponds currently active. There were wars and things of the such between islands, within islands, that occurred throughout the pre-contact period. Whether or not this has to do with population control or just being power hungry, it's open for interpretation.
Great. Well, these have been really great questions from the audience, and we've really enjoyed talking with you today, and I appreciate your participation in the New Hampshire Archaeological Society 2021 series.